Hello, my name is Eric Patterson, and I serve as Executive Vice President of the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. This is RFI's 3 Questions on Ukraine interview series. At RFI, we work to secure religious freedom for everyone, everywhere around the world. The purpose of the 3 Questions on Ukraine interview series, in the context of the ongoing conflict there, is to provide better understanding of the religious dimensions of the conflict in the region, with a special focus on areas of religious freedom in Ukraine and its neighborhood. My guest today is Dr. Mark Elliott, a retired professor from Asbury University and a distinguished historian with service at Wheaton, Asbury, and other universities in the past. Dr. Elliott, welcome.
Good to be here.
Well, I've been reading your newsletter on a regular basis. Mark, tell us, from the things that you are seeing on the ground and from your contacts there, what might we be missing in the daily news?
Well, there's been a tremendous amount of focus, of course, on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But what is less often seen in the reports is what people are living with on the ground, especially in terms of believers, how they are dealing with this crisis. Of course, a quarter of the entire population has been displaced, either internally or externally. And services continue in some locations where it's safe enough, but there are thousands of churches that are no longer functioning as they would normally because of the dangers of the invasion.
Could you tell us a bit more about this part of it, the religious and the spiritual dynamics, whether it comes to the lack of services being provided or the difficulty that faith-based organizations are having in meeting the needs of the Ukrainian people?
Well, thinking about difficulties, one city comes to mind immediately for me, and that's Irpin. It's a northwest suburb or exurb of the capital of Kiev. And before the outbreak of the war, it was something like the Wheaton or the Colorado Springs of the former Soviet Union, something like 25 different Christian charities, predominantly Protestant, were headquartered there. It was a city of, I don't know, maybe 50,000 people with something like 25 Protestant churches, very unusual because the majority of believers in Ukraine are Orthodox or Catholic. But Irpin is just one example. And to give you a concrete example, I've been associated with one ministry called Mission Eurasia for decades, off and on, and its headquarters was destroyed by a tank conflict in the streets of Irpin. And to give you a horrific side to this one single incident, there was a warehouse at the back of the property, and Russian troops broke into the warehouse and they made a bonfire of Christian books and Bibles. So it was a very intentional example of an attempt to destroy the culture of Ukraine. And what's so extraordinary to me is that the Bibles that were destroyed, the majority of them, were the edition approved by the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow. I don't know how to comprehend that.
Wow. This really is striking, and it's not the type of thing that we hear about so much in the press, but this type of vandalism, looting, kind of willful destruction, whether it is the news report yesterday from the BBC that came out that about finding a booby trap in a civilian home's washing machine. In other words, these acts that seem just belligerent and mean-spirited, not traditional acts of war, but how much more chilling to think about the burning of libraries, the burning of Christian materials, houses of worship, Bibles like this. It's a disregard for truth in many, many ways. Now, did the people of Irpin flee? Did they stay? What else do you know from there?
Well, many people fled. Some hid in basements, in bomb shelters and the like. it was a mixed picture, and of course a chaotic picture, and we don't know the full story yet. But speaking of the nightmare of atrocities, it's not that these things haven't gone on in war ad infinitum over millennia, but I think one aspect of it that's different this time around is that the degree of social media's intervention, exploration, observation of what's going on is unprecedented. It's going to be one of the reasons why the war crimes of the Russians are going to be so thoroughly documented, I think, compared to any other instance in history. We just have phone footage of people's cameras documenting atrocity after atrocity.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And it's part of this is one of the things that has made this complex, because part of the reporting I've been watching this week is attacks on civilians, but civilians who were interrogated often would have photos on their phones of Russian troop movements, Russian tanks and things. The way we used to think about the laws of armed conflict is that if a civilian out of uniform had materials like that, they might be considered a saboteur or a spy and up for summary judgment. Resistance fighters operate in a gray area when it comes to the laws of armed conflict. But in this case, what we're talking about is the aggression right in their backyard. What do you expect them to do when tanks are rolling down Main Street and soldiers are knocking on their door, but to record it and to report on it? So it really is a complicated situation. Let me ask you, because of your deep church context there, how is the church faring in all of this in Ukraine?
You know, this entire work is a series of surprises. My wife and I made a list of about 25 things that have occurred that would have been unexpected. Of course, there are the many obvious surprises, like the failure of the Russians to overrun the country as quickly as Western intelligence and Putin expected. The surprise of Zelensky's extraordinary capacity for communication and leadership. But in terms of the churches, what has been so extraordinary to me is the level of unity and singleness of purpose across many confessional and denominational lines. It's really quite extraordinary. It actually didn't start with this invasion. It really started with the Maidan Revolution of Dignity in 2014. And on that Maidan Square, there were Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestants praying together. Maybe that doesn't seem so odd or curious in the American context, where we have a tradition of living and letting live in a spiritual sense. I mean, there's a level of tolerance in the United States that's one of our hallmarks and something that we should be proud of, relatively speaking. I mean, it's not perfect, of course, but it's unusual in the European context historically and in the former Soviet Union specifically. But this level of working together, which occurred in the Maidan Revolution of 2014 and is occurring today, is really quite a remarkable phenomenon. In years past, we used to think of the ecumenism of the prison. You know, Solzhenitsyn and others reported about Orthodox and Protestants and Catholics praying together and encouraging each other in the jail cells, in the gulag. There's the famous illustration in Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, when the singular character of the little novel remarks positively about a Baptist praying, for example. That's just a small example, but there are many, many examples of that. So there's the ecumenism of the prison, but now there is, I think, a very healthy type of ecumenism in the expressions and the response of churches in Ukraine. Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants working together, helping each other, praying for each other. Isn't it ironic that Putin, who wants to destroy Ukraine, has done more than any other person to unite the Ukrainians spiritually, but also politically. You know, Ukraine was terribly divided politically before 2014. And Putin, ironically, has united the country as never before.
Yeah, it's really stunning what you say, and it's useful to remind us about the 2014 Maidan Revolution, which was an uprising against the corruption of the pro-Russian government, and really an uprising not just against that government, but the previous decade of political turmoil and the back and forth, going back to the Orange Revolution and things. But the fact that there was an instability, and it seemed that anyone who came to office had a lot of pressure on them by Russia. There was uncertainty about the West and NATO. Ukraine was always caught between a rock and a hard place. And by default, it would fall back to old patterns of crony types of political action. And of course, there was competition in the church as well, and among churches. Right. And I was always stunned by two things on CNN during the revolution. The first one was that they showed, but they didn't report on. Those are the two facets. They showed, but they did not report that right behind the speakers at the podium on that main stage during Maidan were the religious leaders from across the country holding hands and singing often hymns and national songs in unity. And so you'd have the Baptist in a suit next to Ukrainian Orthodox in robes, next to a Catholic in clerical attire, next to a Russian Orthodox, and then a Jewish rabbi side by side on that stage over that time period, and a true demonstration of, in a sense, the revolutionary potential of religious freedom to unify people towards a common set of purposes for the common good, not for exclusion, but for a better life for all Ukrainians. Now, have you seen that continued over the past several years since 2014?
Yes, I have. And there was an illustration of it just within the last 48 hours. The current head of the Council of Religious Associations in Ukraine is headed by Grigory Komendant, who until quite recently was also head of the Russian, not the Russian, but the Ukrainian Bible Society. And a plea went out for all of the religious associations of Ukraine to work together to document the atrocities that have occurred, many of which are now just coming to light as Ukrainian troops are retaking some territories previously occupied by Russian forces. So there's again that common purpose and that unity of purpose that we're seeing come to the fore.
Yeah, and we've seen the religious people play a vital role in either documenting or providing a forum for documenting in other places around the world. After the UN intervention in East Timor, it was actually the military chaplains assigned to that invasion force from Australia that were actually given the records to hold on to for later war crimes trials. We've seen it in Latin America, the role particularly the Catholic Church, but also Protestants have played in providing a witness, a never again type of witness in those places. And here we have it again. There's an established network and trusted institutions and means of communication within church and social networks that can be called upon during this very, very important time. So it's an incredible moment that we're watching right in front of us in Ukraine. Well, Dr. Elliott, what have we missed? What else should we say for today?
Well, I think the level of Christian compassion in an organized fashion, assisting the huge refugee population, is a story that's been reported on, but so much more could be said about it. And again, there's this dimension of many different Christian confessions and denominations stepping up. It occurs in terms of churches. It occurs in terms of mission organizations and even individual believers. I mean, there are cases of Americans, Ukrainian Americans, but also people who have no Slavic background, getting on planes, going to Poland, Moldova, Prague, Hungary, and serving wherever they can. And likewise, Christians in Europe getting in their cars and vans, filling their vans up with supplies of various kinds and just driving to Poland. So at the grassroots level and at the institutional level, just extraordinary examples of Christian compassion have been documented and continue to this day.
You know, that's such a great reminder. And it's a reminder that governments can't do everything, nor should they. And a key principle when we think about religious liberty is it's a reminder that government has a role, and it's a critical role to play for security and for order and for justice, but that there's no way that any government or even set of governments can meet all the needs of all people. And in fact, it's illegitimate to try to do so. And so we see in this case the valiant role that the Polish government and some other governments are playing in that area, but also the valiant role that Polish people, Polish religious institutions, and then further abroad, just like you said, the distribution of aid through religious and other networks as people are acting on their faith, putting legs on their faith, putting their pocketbooks in service of their faith to try to help in this devastating conflict. And of course, when the Russians do leave to whatever eastern border is figured out, there's going to be a lot of long-term work for religious people to do to serve the needs of those around them in grief counseling and restoration services and the like. So there's more to come.
Yeah.
Dr. Elliott, thank you very much for your insightful comments today. Again, my guest is Dr. Mark Elliott, a distinguished historian and professor. Dr. Elliott, thank you.
Thank you.